for joining us. A very compact number of individuals who turned up today. But, you know, if it's one or if it's 2,000, to me, it's exactly the same in terms of how I undertake my lectures. But obviously, there's a lot more of a kind of homely field by having, you know, individuals like yourselves joining us today. So my name is Gurinder Singh Mann. I'm a Sikh historian for 20 years, actually. I got my start in 1997 whilst I was undertaking my MA in South Asian religions here at De Montfort University here in Leicester. And I actually undertook scriptural work, actually, which is very interesting and very poignant, related to, you know, scriptures, you know, from different faiths as well. And whilst the Sikhs have faith in the Guru Granth Sahib, which is what we call the primal scripture of the Sikhs, I actually focused on the secondary scripture called the Dasam Granth, which is the scripture related to the founder of the Khalsa, Guru Gobind Singh. And the reason I focused on that was because of some textual issues which had kind of rumbled on in the Sikh diaspora as to authenticity. So I kind of looked at the secondary scripture because it was almost like, well, I go to the Gurudwara or Sikh temple and I'm venerating a scripture, but yet there's a secondary scripture. How does that figure? How does it work? I don't understand it. So I started my MA. I did that in that particular scripture, and I became pretty famous actually just from that MA, in the sense that it was very, very kind of hotly debated across, like I said, the Sikh diaspora. And as a result of that, it kind of catapulted me into actually a worldly kind of arena. And I've written 2 books on the secondary scripture called the Dasam Granth, and one insightfully and nicely is published by Oxford University Press as well. So that's given me another kind of global kind of audience as well. So that's just literally from the scriptural side, essentially. But in my main kind of work has been related to heritage as well. Essentially Sikh heritage, how Sikh heritage is portrayed in the UK and across the world as well. So, you know, I've done lectures here in the UK at universities, America, Europe, India as well. So, you know, I've had a great time in terms of actually kind of expounding various things related to Sikh heritage. And secondary to the Sikh heritage is artifacts and relics as well. The journey of how relics and artifacts from the Punjab area of India have actually reached the UK. And secondary to my being a historian is I am the director of the Sikh Museum Initiative as well, which is a kind of a think tank stroke organization which actually tries to kind of bring together Anglo-Sikh connections. So we do exhibitions, we do lectures, and our recent project is the Anglo-Sikh Virtual Museum, which is essentially a museum where you can actually see objects in 3D, essentially. And that kind of brings us to like an almost kind of an actual, well, not finishing, so to speak, it actually brings us to an actual great kind of juncture, especially during the COVID situation as well, whereas museums have been shut. We've had an online museum where everyone has been visiting, but also we've been able to undertake webinars in relation to objects as well. So, you know, it's kind of worked out very, very interestingly in how we actually kind of disseminate information from a Sikh perspective, but also has British kind of connections as well. So that kind of gives you kind of insight into the kind of work I've done. But also during the pandemic, I released my 3rd book as well, entitled The British and the Sikhs, Discovery, Warfare and Friendship, circa 1700-1900. All right, bit of a mouthful. We did kind of debate as to why there were so many titles, but I left that with the publisher, essentially. But yeah, that came out in March this year. And again, obviously there's no face-to-face kind of interactions in relation to the book, but I've managed to undertake many webinars across the world, you know, with global audiences in terms of how, you know, what this subject is about. And this subject we're going to be discussing today, British and Sikhs, is not something that I've just kind of thought about in the last year or 2 years. It's been something very pivotal from when I started looking at Sikh history from day one. And, you know, it's proven to be a very, very kind of a big minefield of information. So essentially, whilst we look at the period from 1800 onwards, where we start getting the greater connections between the British and the Sikhs, it's kind of made me think and even look even prior to that as well. I'm going to cite some examples in a moment, but to cite examples from the earliest connections between the British and the Sikhs. And that has proved to be very, very fascinating. And when I was writing this book, it's given me enough material to write maybe 2 more books. It was that kind of, powerful in finding these sources. So it's been a great journey just writing this book, but to find, other sources as well. And it's very, very interesting because we talk about the East India Company, and it's kind of almost where we're about to start, but we talk about the East India Company, and they were great record keepers essentially. So, that is where, it helps us to actually formulate ideas. There may be some biases in terms of the understanding of cultures and some of the religions and the precepts, etc. But there's some areas where they were actually spot on as well, because the East India Company, as we know, was a trading company, but they brought with them number of writers, even poets and everybody, and even armies. So it was just like a complete kind of retinue of people that they had. And this included, very, very talented writers and, poets and, Orientalists were kind of forming as well. So it was a very, very fascinating period for the East India Company from the 18th century going into the 19th. But I am going to start my presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen, if that's okay. Firstly, what I'm going to say is, because you do have several screens showing at the same time, can you guys see the PowerPoint presentation? Just wave if that's okay, or yeah, that's great. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start in terms of looking at a Anglo-Sikh history timeline. I'm not going to go into it in depth, but essentially, in fact, I might start off with this slide first and go back to that one. I think before we even start, we have to define who the Sikhs are. And so the Sikhs have generally resided in the area of the Punjab, which is a large fertile area of India. And Sikhism is the religion founded in the Punjab, and the founder of the faith was Guru Nanak in the 15th century. He was followed by 9 other gurus, and the Sikhs essentially followed the scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib. So that kind of is the very, very basic epitome in terms of who the Sikhs are. But, we did have 9 other preceptors leading up to the 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, and to the foundation of what we call the Khalsa, or the fraternity of the pure. Now, a presentation seems to be running ahead of me. I think there may be some timings in there. But the idea for the Sikhs, in fact, I'm just going to put it out there if that's okay. Just give me 1 second. I'll just share the actual, yeah, I'll share that if that's okay. Yeah, so essentially, when we came to the 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, he wanted to formalize the Sikhs into what we call the Khalsa, or the fraternity of the pure. So it was a code where the Sikhs became saint soldiers, essentially. So, whilst the Sikhs have been defined by, to some extent, a pacifist nature, which books of very many commentators have kind of idolized Guru Nanak, and something I'll talk about later on, the militant strain has always been kind of defined by Guru Gobind Singh and the fraternity, what we call as the Khalsa. And after Guru Gobind Singh's demise, he did kind of ordain that the actual Guru Granth Sahib would be the primal scripture for them to follow. And even though he wrote his own writings in what I've already kind of described earlier on, which was the Dasam Granth. But in order to actually kind of define the 18th century in terms of after the Guru period as well, it kind of gives us a great kind of indicator in terms of the kind of connections that were made with the British. And whilst we know the East India Company formed around about 1600, it's quite clear to say the actual interactions with the Sikhs was very limited at the start, if that makes sense. And essentially, it was only from the 1700 onwards that the Sikhs actually had some kind of connection with the British. And even the early 1700 period, there wasn't that many connections either. It was more late 1760s and 70s onwards where we actually start seeing some of the descriptions that we kind of formulated, which are covered in my book as well. So essentially 1700 is what we could call the Guru period. And that is when the Guru's demise, and is actually the Khalsa is kind of led by warriors, primarily one called Banda Singh Bahadur, which I'll refer to shortly. And the Sikhs actually formatted themselves into confederacies known as the Missals, which were kind of bands of warriors, which were trying to actually kind of fight against the Afghans and the Mughals as well. So it was a true they were kind of being kind of persecuted from all sides, essentially. And, you know, they came through it. And it was the Missals, the leaders of the Missals, who actually kind of got them through this very torrid time. Get to about 1800, and the Sikhs are kind of united under one leader, namely Maharajah Ranjit Singh, and that's when we start seeing the Sikh Empire. That leads to a kind of glory period, leading to about 1849, when we start seeing 1845 to 1849, when we see the Anglo-Sikh Wars, which is tensions between the East India Company and the Sikh Empire, leading to the annexation of the Punjab in 1849, and then it's British domination of the Punjab, leading to what we call the Indian Mutiny a few years later on, and therefore also the employment of Sikhs in the British Indian Army, leading all the way to the 1900 period, and then beyond, where Sikhs were recruited in many numbers across world wars, World War I and World War II. That's almost like a very succinct history of the Sikhs within this one slide, but it kind of just gives you the certain or different kind of periods, essentially, which Sikh history can be broken down to from a circa 1700s. Obviously, like I said, Gurinder was around from the mid 1400s, so it's a different period, but this is more looking at how the interaction with the British would have taken place. Okay, so as part of my book, The British and the Sikhs, what I wanted to do was to actually look at various kind of connections between certain anecdotes which have been noted by the East India Company, but then actually to bring them into the fore as part of this particular book. And like I said, one of the first kind of instances of where the Sikhs are actually noted is by an embassy of the East India Company when they visit Delhi, for instance. And in circumstances where we would actually probably would have liked to have seen the Sikhs have probably a better kind of, an introduction in the Western world. Unfortunately, it's more about martyrdom. So in the Sikh tradition, we call it Shahidi, but the word martyrdom, as we know across all cultures, features very, very widely within the Christian faith, the Islamic faith, and within the Sikh faith as well. So this general called Banda Singh Bahadur was actually about to be executed, and his followers were being executed because he'd actually led a revolt against the Mughal Empire after Guru Gobind Singh. And the embassy of John Sermon et al. Of the East India Company actually left this really, really interesting statement about Banda Singh and what was about to take place. Now, essentially, I'm not going to read through the whole account, but essentially what he's saying is that hundreds and hundreds of Sikhs are actually beheaded. Well, 100 per day are beheaded in Delhi. And the key point which they make is it's not a little remarkable with what patience they undergo their fate. And to the last, it's not been found that one apostatized from his new reformed religion. And this was a very, very interesting quote, because it's talking about, the Sikhs having this kind of mindset where they did not renounce their faith, even in the face of, barbarity, etc. But it was fascinating just to note that this is one of the earliest kind of anecdotes which refers to Banda Singh and his execution at that time from the early 1700 onwards, so to speak. This just kind of demonstrates a fresco of Banda Singh, which is in one of his kind of gurdwaras, and that's the martyrdom site on the right-hand side in Delhi, which I visited in 2018, and it does feature in my book as well. It's very, very paramount, because I think sometimes when we have these anecdotes, I think personally as a field scholar, I find that I would also want to visit the place where some of these kind of events have taken place as well. And, I've been very lucky in terms of actually having kind of, seen some of the earliest scriptures of the Sikh faith, the weaponry of the Sikh faith, and also visiting some of these kind of martyrdom sites as well. And interestingly, even to this day, even sites like this are very, very not well known even amongst the Sikh community as well. So it's about education, but re-education to some extent as well. So generally, the early anecdote that was mentioned was very, very interesting. But however, there is a bit of a lull period where we don't seem to get many other quotes or many kind of interaction with the Sikhs. There is a few, but one which I selected for my book was by Charles Wilkins. And he was an actual writer and translator, and then later went on to found the Asiatic Researchers, which was a kind of like a publication in Calcutta. And Calcutta was later on to become a very, very fundamental area related to the British and the Sikhs, as the Fort William College was based there. And that is where, you know, a lot of translators were kept there. And later on, the Christian missionaries based themselves there as well in Fort William. So Charles Wilkins actually is not talking about the Punjab now. So whilst we talk about the Sikhs as being kind of localized in the Punjab, but the place called Patna, what we refer to as Patna Sahib, was actually where Guru Gobind Singh was born, actually. So the area of Patna, which is kind of related more famously for the Buddha, for instance, from the Buddhist faith. But interestingly, Charles Wilkins actually goes to Patna, and what he does, he actually goes into a place of worship, and he's saying that I've been asked to take my shoes off. And I think whilst I'm referring to the next couple of slides, anyone who's been to a Gurdwara can actually see some of the similarities, and hence why I actually chose this quote as part of my book. And it's a very, very interesting quote that he makes. But sorry, it's not a quote, it is actually a massive account, but it's summarized here. So what he's saying is that he enters this building, this place of worship, essentially, and he's been asked to cover his head, as we do in a Sikh temple. And that he politely conducted himself, and he sat in the on the carpet amidst of an assembly, and he said it was packed as well. So he goes on to actually say the congregation arranged themselves on the carpet on each side of the hall as to leave a space before the altar from end to end. The great book, and he's referring to the Guru Granth Sahib here, was brought, and with some ceremony from the altar placed at the opposite extremity of the hall. And then he refers to how there's some recitations, but it's also talking about an individual beating of a drum and cymbals as well being beat. So, and then there's chants, and basically the kind of description that he's making is no different to how the actual Sikh scriptures are actually opened and the reverence of them to this very day. And this, and Charles Wilkins went to Patna in 1781, even though this account was actually published in 1788, it is actually from 1781. And he continues, and he actually says, with a loud voice and distinct accent, solemnly pronounced a long prayer or liturgy at certain periods of which all the people joined in a great response, saying, Wahe Guru. Essentially, what is taking place there is what we call the ardas, or petition, which normally takes place after various ceremonies. It takes place after religious functions as well. So it's the ardas which is being recited at that particular point. And he talks about the prayers that have been undertaken. And then he refers to what we can refer to an invitation to the assembly to partake of a friendly feast. I did like the usage of the word friendly feast, and then talking about the scripture being placed to its natural place of where it should be staying. But the idea of the friendly feast is what we refer to as the prasad, which is given also during the recitation of the scriptures, but also the langar, in terms of where, you know, the Sikhs have a world-renowned kind of notoriety for feeding the poor, the oppressed, and it's just so fascinating to see this absolute great kind of description by Wilkins. I think I must have found this maybe in the earlier period of when I was researching Sikh history, but to me this still fascinates me even to this very day. So I really do like actually recounting this particular kind of anecdote. So we're going to go a bit further into history now, just to say that the interactions of, say, from the 1780 onwards did take place with the British, but they were more from a military kind of point of view. It was the East India Company, Warren Hastings, for instance, having interactions with the Sikhs, not directly, but through kind of through letters, for instance, and even some of his kind of envoys which are sent to Delhi. The Sikhs were kind of also kind of pushing their way to Delhi. Circa 1783 is a very pivotal point where General Bagheil Singh actually takes over Delhi in 1783, and who actually appears on the cover of my book as well, which you could probably just about see. But Bagheil Singh actually appears on the cover of my British and the Sikhs book. And it's just to actually kind of state that during that time, the British were actually alarmed to actually and to know that there was another group or another power which had all of a sudden come to the fore in the kind of melting pot of who was taking over Delhi at that particular point. The East India Company were very, very kind of eager to take, you know, the kind of city as well. So it was very interesting. That's why I put Bagheil Singh on the cover. But if we move forward a couple of decades, we actually get to what we call the Sikh Empire and the Punjab, essentially. And this is where we get one ruler, namely Maharajah Ranjit Singh, who actually becomes supreme amongst all the Misl leaders and actually carves out what we call the Sikh Empire from around 1799 onwards. And he's pivotal to ensuring that there's a great stability in the Punjab after all the persecutions which take place as well. So essentially it's a glory period of the Sikhs. He deals in modernization, reforms, and investment in infrastructure. There's also a cultural and artistic renaissance as well. And he creates mints. But an interesting aspect of his tenure is that it is very, very plural, in the sense that various kind of religious tolerances are in place. The mosques that he's taken over, they're not kind of torn down. They're actually kind of promoted. He gives money towards a mosque. He's giving money towards the Hindu temples, and obviously giving money towards the Gurdwaras as well. And in a way, he actually beautifies some of the actual existing Sikh temples, including the Harimandir Sahib, which is commonly known as the Golden Temple as well. So it's to his credit that a lot of people flocked to the Sikh Empire to actually know that law and order was at its very minimum during the time of the Sikh Empire as well. So, and able to actually promote this interfaith perspective. And that's why it's not too, it's not, we wouldn't use the word that it's unusual, but that's why even Europeans flocked to Maharajah Ranjit Singh court. And, that's why there were so many European generals who were part of his army. So it just shows this pluralistic nature of the Sikh Empire at that particular time. But things were happening in the background, and this essentially came from the East India Company under the Charter Act of 1813, which was essentially giving Parliament renewing the charter to the East India Company to continue the company rule in India. And when I first actually found or read about the Charter Act, it really, really fascinated me. To me, it was like an act passed in Parliament in the UK can actually have ramifications for people thousands and thousands of miles away. To me, it was just kind of, it was just interesting to know how this could actually work in totality, or in reality, so to speak. And the key thing to bear in mind is that the East India Company had this monopoly of where money was being given to them in terms of how they actually use this money. And that was generally for might, for resources, for keeping their armies. But it was also a case that the Christian missionaries were now actually kind of very, very strong now, and pushing Parliament to actually give them leverage to actually go and actually preach in India as well. So in 1813, to use this quote, used to countenance missionary activity in India, and that should be prescribed the Bible and forbade religious education in support of a policy of religious neutrality, and on the basis that if exposed to Christianity, Indians may have felt threatened and thus would have posed a threat to British commercial ventures. So it's all about the East India Company keeping the Christian missionaries out of India as well, because it was also a threat to the East India Company, which was very fascinating for me to actually understand this. But there was also missions created by the Danish, for instance, the prominent one being in Serampore, which is very, very widely known. But the three, which we refer to as the Serampore trio of Marshman, Ward, and William Carey, they were able to break through into the Danish mission. and they were able to actually start their, their actual activities within India, actually. And it was only a matter of time before the Charter Act of 1813 did give that kind of litmus paper for Christian missionaries to preach within India. But this was also down to an individual who's also very famous, as we probably know, William Wilberforce, who, he was known for, kind of preaching against the anti-slave trade, for instance. But he gave a staggering 3-hour speech in Parliament in favor of Christian missionaries, which actually was, the kind of tipping point to give Christian missionaries this green light that I keep referring to. And interestingly, it was William Carey who became instrumental in setting up missions across India after he set up a printing press as well. So that was a key kind of, it was also technology. So a printing press is technology, and it was this technology which actually gave, the missionaries a very, very kind of upper hand. And this led to the Bible being translated in various languages across the India primarily, whether it be Bengali, Marathi, Hindi, etc. But just a little bit about William Carey before I go on to the next slide is the fact that William Carey was actually born in Leicester. So even very, very interesting is that he was born in Leicester. And the actual church, which kind of commemorates his kind of his work, is the Baptist Church, which is Central Baptist Church, which is located in Charles Street, and which you can also kind of get through into from Granby Street, Leicester as well. So he's actually a product of Leicester, and the product of Leicester is very interesting for me, just as a historian from Leicester, but also knowing that how famous he was to later to become. Even if he's not recognized in Leicester, he's actually very, very famous in America, if not across the rest of the world, because various institutes related to William Carey in America as well. So very, very famous individual who actually kind of paved the way for Christian missionaries in India, essentially. And he created what we could call a translation center. And whilst we refer to various languages and various kind of texts which were created in those so-forth languages, it was the Punjabi and the Sikh texts which I'm very, very kind of interested in. And it was between 1811 and 1826 that he started creating these translations with his team and translation centers, and included the Bible, the New Testament, and the Pentateuch as well. So, and this was just within about a number of years, essentially. So that was fascinating to actually see as well. But obviously this was going to have ramifications. Now, from what I understand, William Carey and these translators never went to the Punjab. They were based in Calcutta, but then they were sending out these Bibles and translations all across India, essentially. And also together with the translations was also the idea of grammar as well, creating these grammar texts. And like I mentioned about the printing press, it's also about the creation of fonts as well for different languages. And essentially within this text, a grammar of the Punjabi language by Carey, he says the language which this grammar is intended to teach is spoken by the Sikh or Sikhs, he writes it, that singular people who inhabit the Punjab or the country line between the Sutlej, that's the river, and the Indus River. The following sheets are intended to furnish short and appropriate rules for the acquisition of this language without attempting any remarks on the nature of grammar in general. Now this text is very, very small, but just kind of shows you to the lengths that these missionaries went to actually understand, firstly, the Sikh language, then to create the kind of text, and then is what follows on from that, essentially. So, which is the ramifications, and which I'm going to refer to now. So, according to William Carey's biographer, which he quotes, he actually said the Punjabi Bible, nearly complete, issued first in 1815, had become so popular by 1820 as to lead Carey to report to Sikhs that no one of the nations of India had discovered a stronger desire for the scriptures than this hardy race. At Amritsar and Lahore, the book of Jesus being spoken of is read and has caused a considerable stir in the minds of the people. So this is a very, very interesting quote in terms of actually how it kind of helped in terms of the formation and the setting up of churches in the Punjab, just based on the fact that the Bibles had been sent in their hundreds over to the Punjab. And we can see, I think it's this slide here. Yeah, we see that I think it's the early 1800s where we actually start seeing the first Presbyterian church being set up. It was under the American mission, actually, under Reverend John C. Lowry. And he actually wrote a great book, essentially, which talks about him setting up the mission, the actual church, and also his interaction with Maharajah Ranjit Singh. So this was very interesting. It's one thing to have a church, but to actually have the ruler of the Punjab having a dialogue with him as well, in terms of it's kind of like an interfaith dialogue. But from what I understand, Lowry had presented the Bible to Maharajah Ranjit Singh, and essentially, you know, he actually said that after being seated on the floor like the rest and after exchanging the usual compliments, I presented the English Bible and Gurmukhi Pentateuch I had brought with me for that purpose. So he actually presented the Bible to Maharajah Ranjit Singh. However, it was very interesting because when we sometimes look at Sikh warriors, there's one particular group referred to as the Nihangs or the Akali Nihangs. And they're kind of an interesting, I should have actually put a diagram or a portrait here, but the Nihangs can actually identify by having the conical turbans with quoits around their turbans as well. And they actually have daggers in them as well. So they're actually set apart from other Sikhs, essentially. And it was the Akali Nihangs who were a barrier against conversion, according to Lowry. What he's saying is that there's perhaps reason to hope that the wickedness of these people, referring to the Akalis, will contribute much to cut short their sway and to render men more willing to receive the teachers of our mild and pure religion. So what he's basically saying is, because the Akali Nihangs, and just to put in perspective, the Nihangs were not only just custodians of the Sikh Gurdwaras, but they were warriors, so hence essentially saint soldiers. So as a result, they were swaying, you know, the doctrine of the Sikh faith to all the masses. And then for them, for Lowry and the Christian missionaries, it was the Nihangs they felt that was the main barrier. And it's an interesting quote, like I said, which Lowry mentions. I also refer to another anecdote in my book, which refers to a lady Nihang, and where a Christian missionary is trying to convert her into Christianity. And she can read the Punjabi Bible very fluently, and the anecdote refers to her reading it fluently. And again, the kind of commentator is actually thinking, well, what's going on with all these quotes and everything? But what we don't see, and what we probably need a bit more kind of research, is actually, well, what is the actual dialogues which are taking place? Because it seems very one-sided here to actually say that, you know, the Christian missionaries are here, we're preaching the gospel, we're preaching the Bible, but we don't see the interfaith kind of discussion taking place. Did the Christian missionaries actually know what the Sikhs were about? Did they know why the Nihangs were wearing quoits? Did they know that these Nihangs were, you know, consider themselves to be children of Guru Gobind Singh, and as a result, you know, they are 100% in tune with God, if that makes sense, from that perspective. So we don't get those kind of we don't get those interactions, but it's an area and it's something which, you know, I will look into in the future as well, because I think that would give that kind of icing of the cake in terms of interfaith relations at that particular time as well. Okay, so I'm jumping the gun a little bit, and then I'm going to come back to the Anglo-Sikh Wars, but essentially a big missionary conference took place in Lahore in 1862 to 1863. And it was interesting in the sense that various kind of papers were given in terms of how conversions had been undertaken and to the strength of everything that had been undertaken. But Reverend William Keane, he'd actually written many pages related to the Sikh scriptures in terms of what he thought were the kind of peaceful, or shant, in Punjab we call it shant, which is the peaceful nature of compositions, compared to with some of the martial compositions. And essentially what he's now doing is he's kind of dissecting the scriptures. The Guru Granth Sahib, which we generally tend to see as being more peaceful and saintly, and the Dasan Granth, which is more martial in nature. So he actually says, has the teaching of Nanak, Guru Nanak, in any way prepared the Sikhs for the reception of Christianity? And he states that the Nanak's tenets, where understood and believed, must dispossess the mind of many gross errors, superstitions and prejudice which taken firm hold of the Hindu. His spirit of toleration too cannot be without its good effort. effect, sorry. As the influence of Guru Nanak's teaching was for good, so was that of Govind for evil. He, as in Guru Gobind Singh, abused the principle of Nanak to lay the foundation of Sikh independence. In doing so, he roused the very worst passions of the soul, and his influence on the whole did but demoralize and corrupt the peaceful followers of Nanak. And it's a very, very interesting quote, because the missionary here is actually kind of, kind of breaking the Sikh scriptures essentially in 1862. He's actually kind of saying that, the martial side of the Sikhs don't have any kind of resonance with the peaceful nature of the Guru Granth Sahib. And interestingly enough, it was these kind of notions which actually led to later debates amongst Sikhs with the Sikh scriptures as well. But it just shows you where the foundation possibly may have come down from in terms of actually viewing the Sikh scriptures. But this missionary was very, very famous, and I've got the report of William Keane in the appendices of my book as well, which goes into some of the conversations, like I've said. But I think the key thing in terms of the British coming into the Punjab was the Anglo-Sikh Wars. It was the actual entering of this kind of the battles between the Sikh Empire, because Ranjit Singh had passed away in 1839. And as a result of that, several battles took place between the Sikh Empire and the East India Company, 1845 onwards, which was the first Anglo-Sikh Wars. The Sikhs were defeated. And then essentially Maharajah Duleep Singh. So Duleep Singh was the son of Maharajah Ranjit Singh. And he was just like a ward, and he was very young, and his mother was reigning at the time, called Maharani Jindan Kaur. But the Governor General at the time decided that it was time to part ways with this kind of quasi-rule, and he banished Maharani Jindan Kaur from the Sikh court, so to speak. And Maharajah Duleep Singh, as a young child, had to tender his submission, even after the Second Anglo-Sikh War in 1849, which included the submission of the Kohinoor diamond, which is very, very famous amongst everybody in the world. And this was all related to this, the battles and the Anglo-Sikh Wars. So who's Maharajah Duleep Singh? Well, essentially, he undersaw or oversaw the annexation of the Punjab in 1849. But strangely enough, Maharajah Duleep Singh was probably one of hardly any Sikh princes who was converted to Christianity, and essentially was taken to the UK. And to this day, the conversion is it seemed controversial to this very, very day. And he was brought to the UK. He lived as an aristocrat. And in a sense, it was a victory for Christian missionaries, as they had converted a very, very prominent Sikh Maharaja, essentially. But later on in life, Duleep Singh did actually re-embrace the Sikh faith as well in his later years. However, when he did die, he was actually buried in Thetford in the area of Norfolk. And I worked with the Ancient House Museum in Thetford for many years in terms of actually bringing out the stories of Duleep Singh. So it just kind of shows this kind of full circle of conversions taking place. But my final slide essentially refers to these individuals who were involved in Maharajah Duleep Singh's conversion. So on this side, we have John Logan, who was his tutor. We had Lord Dalhousie, who was the Governor General and was instrumental in taking Duleep Singh out of the Punjab. And interestingly, on his voyage to the UK, this Bible was presented to Duleep Singh as well. And it still exists to this very day, and the Bible is actually kept in Ancient House Museum as well. And it's a very, very interesting Bible. It's very, very elaborate as well. And the last two pictures there at the bottom, you've got me in one picture, is the actual burial or graves of Maharajah Duleep Singh, his wife, and one of his children as well. So, it just kind of shows you how full circle, how the Sikh Empire was kind of changed and also eroded, also due to the impact that certain aspects of Christianity had on the Sikh faith. And the idea of a Sikh being buried, I remember Sikhs believe in the idea of cremation, and for a Sikh to be buried in Thetford still creates ripples to this very, very day. And, there's always aspects of certain people stating that it should be, the body should be exhumed, and then, they should be repatriated to the Punjab and he should be cremated. But, you know, that story's been going on for many decades. And generally you would find that majority of people would probably say it's probably better that, you know, the family are resting here in the UK. And, you know, this is where the story, as much as it may be painful to the Sikhs, is still should be a kind of interesting talking point as well in terms of how British-Sikh relations continue from here on onwards. So that kind of almost kind of concludes my talk. I think I've gone over the half an hour period that was due to speak, but just to give you a few links as well. The British and the Sikhs Discovering Warfare is available from hellion.co.uk. My website, the Anglo-Sikh Museum, or the team website, anglo-sikhmuseum.com, is where you can see the 3D virtual exhibits. My own personal website is sikhscholar.co.uk. We're on all the various kind of social media channels as well, and there's an email here, info@sikhmuseum.org.uk. So I'm open for questions, and thanks very much.